Well, we can show a link to the user, but now it's time to figure out how we're going to actually make the link right here something that some other user can visit and actually see some message appear on the screen. So to figure that out, we need to understand how we are going to essentially take that string and encode it into a URL and make sure that that URL can actually be visited by someone else. Now, just so you know, for this first version of this application we're going to be building, the only other person who's going to be able to visit this link is you on your own computer. We'll eventually get a version put together that someone else on another computer can access, but for right now, you're really the only person who's going to be able to access this link for now. Okay, so let's figure out what we're going to do. We first need to understand the different parts of a URL in general. So I have an example URL right here. We're going to divide it out to 4 different parts. The first part is the domain. So that would be like message.com or google.com, ebay.com, or whatever else. Immediately after that, we're going to have what is called the path. The path can be arbitrarily long. So it can be /index.html or /my/messages or whatever else. At some point after that, we get a character, sometimes, not always, of a little question mark, and then a collection of some word equals another word. We refer to this as the query string. It is used to communicate some number of options to a backend server. So for example, I might have color equals red. We can imagine that the query string right here is like an options object, or kind of like a JavaScript object, really. So we can imagine that the word color is like a key, and red is like a value. So inside of a JavaScript object, it would look like that. Finally, at the very end, we have a hash character or a pound symbol, and then some arbitrary value after it. And we refer to that as our hash or fragment part of the URL. Now, out of the entire URL, there is really one part of it that is really dedicated or intended for usage by the browser specifically, so the browser can kind of manage its own information. And that is the hash or fragment here at the very end. So typically, you and I as developers, if we ever have some information that we want to somehow store in the URL, and it is only relevant to the browser and not relevant to some backend server, we will usually store that inside the hash here at the very end. To give you a more practical example of what a URL really looks like, we can really take a look at the URL of the current page that I'm at right now to really get a sense of what these different parts are talking about. So I'm at a website called draw.io, and I use this to put all the diagrams together for this course. I took that URL right there and broke it up in the same fashion. So the domain is draw.io, the path is simply /, and then we've got a query string and a hash fragment. The query string in this case is sending a message to a backend server, and it's telling the backend server that I want to run the draw.io application in the GitHub mode, which means that any diagrams that I create are going to be synchronized to some GitHub repository that I own. So that's some information we want to communicate to a backend server so that the backend server can send me a version of this application that's going to interact with GitHub. But then the actual repository that I want to sync all this information to is something that is only concerned to the browser. Because from this point on, once I get this application running inside my browser, the browser is going to communicate with GitHub directly and figure out how to sync some information up. So inside of the URL, or excuse me, inside the hash or fragment, I have the entire link to my GitHub repository and the file inside that repository that I want to sync this diagram to. So again, domain, the query string, which has some parameters so we want to send to a backend server, and then the hash or fragment, as we call it, that has some information relevant to just my browser and not really anyone else. So with all this in mind, I think that you might be able to understand that we probably want to store that encrypted string inside of the hash or fragment at the very end, because we want to store some information that is really just relevant to a user's browser and not really relevant to a backend server or anything like that. Okay, so now we understand where we might want to save our little encrypted string to communicate with someone else. We want to throw it into the hash. Let's take a pause here, come back, and we're going to figure out how we're going to update the URL that we are visiting whenever we're looking at this application and stick that little hash inside of it. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.